Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about crime and punishment. The main objectives for this chapter are to examine the role of the prison system and the association with the prison system in race and ethnicity, racial disparities in policing, sentencing, and prisons, associations between crime and race, and then racial groups as victims of crimes. So the book talks about prisons first and foremost because prisons, again, are a system of social control. And it's a system of social control that operates to maintain the status quo of the dominant group in power. So again, a question we should always be asking is, who do the police actually work for? So when it comes to the rise of American prisons, well, when we look at it from a racial lens, we see that historically the law existed not to protect non-whites, but only to protect whites, okay? So the law did not historically protect non-whites despite the importance of justice in America. Really, when we talked about justice in America, we were talking historically about justice for whites. As we talked about in the last cluster, we saw what justice for African Americans historically looked like. And again, that was the white mobs lynching people. It was a very dark time. So again, it comes up in this chapter again with the lynch mob as a form of racial terrorism that worked with law enforcement. So the book talks about anybody that was non-white, that so much as walked, in the book used the word uppity. Okay, someone who was too confident. If an African American person was walking down the street and they seemed too confident, often a lynch mob full of white males and females would come along with law enforcement and take them. And again, this is when violence against race was very prevalent back in the day. And so again, it's a very dark times. But at the end of slavery, what we found was the prisons were used as another way to kind of segregate communities and ensure that people that were non-white couldn't rise up. So, for example, the book talks about vagabond laws, in which white people would just use vagabond laws to pick up anybody they thought was just unworthy walking down the street, and they would put them into jails and lock them up. The book talks about the Japanese being interned. Again, throughout history, we have many times where the law subjugated people and maintained the status quo of white domination by ensuring that people that were non-white were not eligible to participate in society. And so again, using the criminal justice system as a means by which to put people in prison was another way to keep them from competing in society even after slavery. And so, again, after slavery, vagabond laws were used to enslave non-whites for any reason that they came up with, okay? The book also uses the prison system to really point out racial inequalities, and it also introduces sex inequalities in the criminal justice system. What you're going to find is that throughout history, you had this rise of American prisons that's definitely gone up, especially in the last 40 years. And historically, depending upon your sex or your race, that was associated with how long your sentence was, for example, how severe your sentence was, for example. Women tend to get less severe, less sentences than men for the same charges. And then people that are white tend to get less sentencing, less charges than someone who is non-white historically. But as we see the rise of the prison system, that became a for-profit system. The increase of women in prison has increased 500% over the last 40 years. The book talks about some statistics like black women are 2.5 times more than white women to go to prison. Again, the racial disparities. Black men are 8 times as likely and Hispanic men 3 times as likely than a white man to go to prison. However, what we've seen from several chapters now is that whites commit more crimes. And the book has statistics that 9 million crimes were committed by whites. I forget, 2020 was the year they were using, and only 3 million by non-whites. But yet, who's the one going to prison? Is it the millions of, is it the whites that are committing the crimes, or is it the non-whites? And as you're going to see, even though whites are committing 3 times as many crimes, black men and Hispanic men are more likely to go to prison because of their race. And again, this starts to point out it's not just a police stigmatization and police targeting, but it's also the criminal justice system itself is institutionally racist. So again, the book opens up talking about the prison system because it's a system of domination that works for those in power. And then again, who is the system working for and what do those in power want? And again, if we live in a capitalist society, the goal is to subjugate people into the lower classes, and races were created to subjugate people into the lower classes. So therefore, the prison system and the police all then are targeting non-whites to just maintain the status quo of white domination, when it's really the whites that are committing the crimes. And if the police were accurately targeting people, they should be targeting white people, even though racial targeting, again, is illegal. But if you were to accurately do it, again, it's the whites that are committing the crimes. Yet they're finding that the police are going after blacks and Hispanics instead of whites. So again, a white person is 2 times as likely to have drugs and contraband in a car, but a Latino is 3 times as likely to get searched than a white person. So again, if the cops knew this knowledge that it's really the white people who are more likely to have drugs and guns in the car, would that bias then skew them to accurately start looking at the people who are actually committing crimes? And again, when you talk about criminal justice, the overarching reason for why people commit crimes in the first place is poverty. And so, yes, you can kind of see within races where you have these statistics that do suggest like there's higher rates of crimes within one race than another, for example. But again, how much of somebody committing a crime is simply because they're in poverty? And so when you really look at it on a larger scale, non-whites were stuck in the lower classes. And so when you put people in the lower classes, you're going to see higher rates of crime within those races themselves. However, there's more whites in the United States, which is why there's more whites committing crimes. But again, if you help people get out of poverty, this is the best way to reduce crime. But if you subjugate entire races and ethnicities into poverty, in which they can't get an education, to get a good job, to get wealth, to rise up the social class ladder, again, you're going to see high rates of crime and drug abuse and violence and all the negative things that come along with poverty. Okay? So again, drug arrests are a perfect example of, what we target the poor for, because, drug abuse tends to be higher with people in poverty, and the book has great statistics about the rates of people being in prison just because of drug offenses. And so again, if you're targeting specific races for drug offenses that are in lower classes, then that's how you end up with the higher races, disproportional races of African Americans and Hispanics being targeted over whites. So fear. Your book comes out with it, and it talks about the negative stereotypes that are attached to races. And again, if you play the stereotype, when you look at how many stereotypes are attached to the group, what are the stereotypes? What are the stereotypes attached to women? And what are the stereotypes attached to the elderly? And what are the stereotypes attached to different races? And then how do we learn about these stereotypes? Again, so we live in a society that's historically racist, sexist, heterosexist, and oftentimes ethnocentric, depending upon our attitudes toward immigrants and different people at different times. Okay? So again, in America, the history of racism, sexism, and all the isms, it's taken a long time for us to deconstruct the negative stereotypes that are attached to races, that are attached to sexes, that are attached to different statuses. Okay? And so, but the socialization of fear and the socialization of assuming that some race commits more crimes, again, is a social process that is not based upon statistics. Again, if we were to accurately socialize people, who's more likely to be committing crimes in the United States, again, we would be socializing that whites are more likely to be committing crimes. Therefore, we should be our fear of crime should be about whites, not a different race. However, in America, your book talks about how we've stigmatized non-whites as the criminals, despite the fact that it's the white people that are committing, 2, 3 times as many crimes as someone who's not. So blacks and Latinos and immigrants are often stigmatized. But what you tend to find is, again, if an immigrant is less likely to commit a crime than somebody who's born in America. Okay, so again, when we start to point fingers at different races and we start to point fingers at immigrants, what we're really doing is just socializing a culture of fear that's not based upon actual statistics, that's not based upon the actual reality. So again, if we were to socialize people correctly, we should socialize that immigrants are less likely to commit crimes. What are they doing right? Why don't immigrants commit as many crimes? Those are the questions we should really be asking. Why do whites commit more crimes? What is it? Is it poverty? Because again, there's more whites in poverty than any other race also. Okay? So again, we're just not properly socializing, who is actually the criminals. So the book talks about the fear of crime associated with racism and how we stigmatize blacks and Latinos as criminals when in fact it's actually the whites and the non-immigrants that are not criminals, okay? So again, over the last 40 years, immigration has increased and crime has decreased. Again, so as you're seeing, the more immigrants we have, they're not committing crime and crime is decreasing. So again, we have to ask questions, because again, immigrating people into the country only creates more workers, and then they pay into the gross domestic product, which then improves the economy, and crime goes down in the process. These are all very pro arguments for why immigration should be allowed. The book also uses the term Arabization of fear, and again, stigmatization due to terrorism because of 9/11. And again, this stereotyping of entire cultures, entire races and ethnicities based upon their country of origin or whatever status is unfair, because again, who's more likely to be a terrorist? Again, and the answer is a white person. If you look at all the history of terrorism in America and terrorism globally, the most likely the person to be a terrorist tends to be white. And again, just look at the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, that's an entire group of people that were anti a great many things, and again, they're labeled as terrorists again. So, but still in modern times, due to stigmatization, there's hate crimes against Asians, Arabs, Africans, African Americans, Latino, based upon religion, if you're Jewish or Muslim, okay? So for us to say that America is a tolerant place, that we are multicultural and embrace diversity, all we have to do is point at, how the criminal justice system targets non-whites. We can look at hate crimes, and depending upon what time frame we're in, you see a rise in hate crimes. Again, lately you saw a rise in Asian hate crimes because of politics blaming Asians for a virus, even though that's not the case. But still, somebody talking about it then created a fear of Asians, which then created a stigmatization of Asians, and then you see the hate crimes that result. And then I think the culmination of it was when you had the slaying of the 6 women, which was incredibly sad. But again, that was just such racially biased. And again, if we look at who's really committing the crimes and who's committing problems, Asians are like the lowest of all the groups to have any social problems. They have high education levels, very low levels of child abuse and domestic violence, low levels of crime, the lowest levels of poverty, yet they're being stigmatized in America. And so again, we have to ask the question of why are they being stigmatized? And again, we point back to the socialization process. And so if we are going to create a better world, we have to think about how we're socializing people. So again, the reasons for crime, poverty is the number one reason. Again, when you have poverty, you have an increase of drugs and violence and gangs. There's the difference between white-collar crime and blue-collar crime, and again, this is based upon your access. So people that are in the lower classes tend to do more burglary, robbery, drug dealing. People in the higher classes tend to do more white-collar crime. Violence against women is brought up in this chapter. Again, 1 in 3 women experience violence, and then it talks about the association between violence against women and race. And again, right now especially, you're starting to see people trying to shed light on the fact that justice does not exist for non-whites as equally as it does for whites. And the Native Americans right now, there's a big trend going on because we're trying to bring awareness to Native American violence against women, which has high rates. The book talks about how when a black woman was historically raped, that there was no justice, but when a white woman was, they were punished severely, okay? So that was really sad. Like, men who rape black women are punished less severely. When you really look at it, why is there not equity across the board? Victimization tends to be higher for non-whites, and why is that? And then black youth are 17 times more likely to be murdered than white youth, and again, why is that? And again, if we just look at the culture of poverty, we start to see a lot of the answers. And so, again, when you subjugate groups of people into the lower classes, then who's the justice system really working for? It's not necessarily working for the poor, it's working for those in power. And so, again, you start to see a lot less justice. And then, depending upon your minority status, it's also associated with how much justice is received. And then the hardest part about all of it is that, again, races and ethnicities were subjugated to the lower classes, which meant society was imposing the social problems associated with poverty on these groups of people. And by continuing to not let them rise up the social class ladder because of prejudice and discrimination, you're continuing this culture of poverty that is then associated with races because they're stuck in poverty and they're not allowed to get out. So again, when it comes to punishment, who do the police work for? Again, we're looking at the dominant group in power. And if you look at the history of the police, sometimes it's really good for the people and sometimes it's historically corrupt and sometimes they're protecting, but sometimes you see a lot of examples where, police brutality against people. And again, who are they arresting more and why? And so again, who commits more crimes? Whites, 3 times as many to 1 compared to non-whites, yet blacks are arrested 3 times to every 1 white. And your book talks about the examples of police brutality, and we're hearing a lot about that in modern times, but again, this is also because of the spread of the media and the fact that it can't be hidden behind closed doors anymore. And I mean, the main reason we have to talk about this, we have to talk about racial injustice and violence against women, is because if you keep it locked up in a closet, it'll continue happening. Because police brutality against African Americans and other races and ethnicities has been going on for hundreds of years. And again, when we talked about the lynchings, it's the police working with the lynch mobs. It wasn't the police going after the lynch mobs. They were, cooperating together. And so again, this has been happening for so long, but it's only in modern times when we have videos that we can record it and then publish it. But I mean, America, we've been shocked. Everyone watched a murder. Like, we watched a murder on camera occurring. And it has affected our psyche. It has hopefully shown us what the police brutality looked like. It's like the Emmett Till murder that started the bus boycotts, which then, led to Martin Luther King and the March on Washington and the Civil Rights Act and things along those lines. But it started out with the murder of Emmett Till, which your book shows in chapter 3 or 4. I think it's chapter 4. Your book has the picture of Emmett Till's open casket. But again, remember that, 2 white men took this 15-year-old boy and castrated him and killed him and left him for dead in the river. And that body was then shown to 1950s America, which showed what racism actually looked like. It was horrifically shocking to America. And again, it caused an entire class consciousness of people to rise up against oppression and brutality. So the police brutality conversation that we're having now, it's not the first time we've had this conversation. It's been going on for a long time. But again, police brutality goes in different ways. I mean, think about the workers' rights union, movements when the police were working with the owners to break up the strikers and, to stop people from fighting for 40-hour work weeks. And, so just depending upon the epoch we're talking about. But again, what would happen if we didn't have the police? We'd all have to sleep with guns under our pillow. So that's always the fine line between, having that social control and then having that freedom. Is we need some social control in society to be able to reduce crime and to be able to reduce the effects of poverty and things along those lines, because we need to feel safe at night. But again, when do we need to instill more checks and balances? Okay, again, the criminal justice system, you see a lot of unjust sentencing depending upon people's race. People that are non-white have been falsely accused and convicted on a lot lesser evidence. The cost of mass incarceration, are prisons helping? Again, as the criminal justice system has grown over the last 40 years, crime rates have dropped by about half. But again, for you to just assume there's a cause and effect ratio would be false. Because again, yes, crime has been going down, but what other factors have been going down? Sex, for example, has been going down. People are having far less teenage sex and things along those lines. But again, is it really the criminal justice system that's causing these social changes, or was it just the internet? Is crime going down by half because people are on their phones and on their Xboxes and they're not out walking the streets with nothing to do, completely bored? So for someone to assume that, just because the people we're putting more people in prisons than we ever have before, the crime is going down. That's, could be a spurious relationship. You could say there's a correlation, but again, is that really what's bringing it down, or is it something more like the internet and technology? So again, are prisons helping? Is there a deterrent effect, so a lot of good questions. But right now we're paying a high price for racialized fear because, again, the police and the criminal justice system are targeting non-whites more than they are whites, despite the fact that whites are the ones committing more crimes, okay? Thank you so much.